for me, this is a very tough project in a very tough location. My family has been in the Wanacue Valley for the last 80 years. I'm the third generation property owner, so besides all the environmental hats that I would wear, I know every piece of this area. And I've worked as a volunteer, as a planning board member, as an environmental commission member, in saving most of the tracks that we're now desecrating with this pipeline. The Muscarelli tract, Candy Awpaw, the Riverview tract. I can go on and on. And so for me, Tranquility Ridge, Sterling Forest, I can go on and on. Cranberry Pond, Granite Land Company, and each and every one of those acquisitions. And many of those acquisitions came at a high price, sometimes politically for people, sometimes from a monetary standpoint. But together, the state of New Jersey put together the largest area of open space we have north of the Pines. And this is a critical area that has been considered environmentally sensitive since the first state plan in 1935, and going way back before. You have to understand that some of these lands are very historic. Many of the forests that were reforested in this area in the 1890s were actually done by Gifford Pinchon, who was a good friend of the Ewitts who owned most of this land. That was owned by the Ringwood Company, some of the same tracks that we're going through. But there are a lot of things that have to be looked at from a state perspective as well as a federal perspective. I was head of the local road association when Monksville was there. I'm the guy who actually forced the wider dams so school buses could pass. And now we're putting a pipeline through that same area and protection of Long Pond ironworks and on and on. But going back to Abram Hewitt, who was the founder of Cooper Hewitt College and who gave the original lands to Ringwood State Park and his descendants, this land was given to the state, those pieces of it, for permanent protection. And you should read his will, because there is intestate protections for the Ringwood Manor properties, including viewshed. It says very clearly, viewshed. And it says very clearly, and I've been involved when they wanted, the town of Ringwood wanted to put some radio towers within that viewshed, that the view from Ringwood Manor shall not be obstructed. That the waters through the Hewitt properties, which are all the old Ringwood Manor properties, shall always be drinkable and swimmable. This pipeline will be putting pollution into those streams. This project will be putting siltation, and just go look at Lake Lookout, which I know quite well, and the problem that you see there. You know, last time I was by Lake Lookout, I saw a black bear going swimming in there, and now I guess it would be a brown bear, but we don't really have them in this part of the country. The other concern that I have is there are a lot of questions that have to be answered. I think first and foremost, you're going through National Historic Landmarks. Ringwood Manor is considered by the National Park Service as a landmark, the same as Mount Vernon. And that viewshed has to be looked at. The viewshed from Skylands Manor, also a national landmark. Long Pond Ironworks State Park, also a national landmark. There's a National Historic District that you're cutting through. And those issues haven't even been looked at. In fact, when I was looking at the map, I love the fact that they keep using a USGS that doesn't even show Monksville Reservoir on it. It shows the state properties in outline, and you can kind of figure out what the reservoir is, but you still don't have the reservoir. And that's the second big issue. Protection of the Wanacue Reservoir in that system, and bringing this pipeline through and the impact on siltation. Other questions that I have, besides SHPO and 208 review, is some of the properties I believe in this area, and my memory may be a little hazy because it's been a 30-year plus battle to save some of these properties. I believe there are land and water conservation funds used in some of these acquisitions. And if there is, there's a prohibition against diversion. And I can give you the Supreme Court case. Sierra Club versus New York State Power Authority, circa 1972, U.S. Supreme Court. So there has to be a review of what properties were potentially purchased with land and water conservation funds. I know Congressman Frelinghuysen was bringing those monies in. So I said you need to look at the deed restrictions on some of your own properties because there are restrictions. Basically for us, this area of New Jersey, and I'm going to talk about the western half, is really one of the most critical areas It is the Yellowstone and Yosemite of New Jersey, and it gets more visitors, by the way. Between the hiking trails, whether it's the Appalachian Trail or all the local trails that were set up over 90 years ago throughout the region, and the impact of those vistas from this trail. More importantly, this is the water supply for 2 million people. And how do you get through a reservoir without causing impact? How do you go through a watershed without causing impact? And quite frankly, I believe that these lands are not replaceable. You cannot mitigate for lands that have some of the oldest rocks in the world. You cannot mitigate for the view shed from Skylands or Ringwood Manor. You cannot mitigate for destruction with this pipeline of critical habitat and water supply areas. You cannot mitigate for drilling through reservoirs or through trout streams. Replacement lands, where are you going to get them? We're going to go up to the Adirondacks because that's where you'll find equal values. There are cliffs up there you can't find anywhere south of New Hampshire. We're going to be cutting through some of those areas. You go up to New Hampshire and buy land. The point that I'm making is that the state of New Jersey has invested billions of dollars in protecting this area. The replacement cost of the Wanacue Reservoir alone would be more than $2 billion. The lands that have been purchased, 75% of Ringwood is open space. And yet, even with all that open space, we passed the Highlands Act to protect it on top of that. And we upgraded all those streams to C1 up there in Highlands waters, because this is an area that should be off limits for this kind of development. This is an industrialization of the most environmentally sensitive and most important water supply watershed in the state of New Jersey, where the public has spent billions of dollars in protecting that resource, and now we're putting a pipeline through it that can go somewhere else because it's a speculative pipeline to bring Marcellus shale gas to New York City. It's not for being used anywhere along this corridor. It's for being used in other places, and there are other places this pipeline can go. Down Route 80, over Route 17. It doesn't have to go through the middle of the Highlands Preservation Area. It doesn't have to go through New Jersey's most important environmental and scenic treasures. And then we go to the western side, the Delaware Water Gap, National Recreation Area, our only really big piece of open space. We've got Stoke State Forest and High Point. Again, important, valuable recreation areas that were passed on for generations to be used, not to be destroyed through the gas pipeline cutting through the middle, cutting a scar. And it's a scar, and the way I would describe it is you have a bunch of parked new cars, and somebody takes a knife and just runs down the side because they say, well, it's only a little bit of scratch. Yeah, you do it through 1,000 cars, you've just impacted the value of 1,000 cars dramatically because of the wider impact of that little scar, and that's what this scar is. And so for us, we think that, quite frankly, we're very upset at this administration because they held up the Smith bill, saying that the DEP was coming out with their own regulations. We haven't seen them, and yet we're going to push this pipeline through when values haven't been set properly, when the Smith bill was held up by this administration, and we haven't seen DEP rules to fix some of the problems that we know that are there when it comes to mitigation, when it comes to values. We've seen some increase in lease value, but the lease value is a small piece of it. So how do you deal with what the impacts are going to be? Is there a no-build alternative? Is there alternatives that we haven't seen? But more importantly, you need to ask the question is what's the impact going to be on those resources that the people of New Jersey have demanded and paid for to be protected, and that people have donated to the state, and what the restrictions that may or may not be. There's still a lot of work to be done, and this project is the wrong project in the wrong place. Just one point on one of the reasons you don't want a pipeline through steep slopes. No matter what you do, you cannot control runoff. So our BMPs are 50% at best. In optimal situations, 30% slope. There is no BMP.